The airport was alive with its usual mix of sounds and movements. The rolling of luggage wheels echoed against the polished floors. Families hurried to their gates, children tugging on their parents' sleeves. Business travelers moved quickly, phones pressed to their ears, eyes fixed on their watches. Among this crowd was a young black woman who walked with a calm confidence. She wore jeans, a neat blouse, and a pair of simple shoes. She carried one bag on her shoulder and held her passport in her hand. She looked like just another traveler, but there was something about the way she carried herself. Her steps were steady, her eyes alert, as if she was aware of everything around her. When she reached the checkpoint, she smiled politely at the officer sitting behind the desk. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a look of authority on his face. But his eyes told another story. They scanned her up and down with suspicion, as if she did not belong there. She greeted him with a soft good morning and handed over her passport. He took it without responding. His eyes narrowed as he flipped through the pages. Instead of the usual quick glance most officers gave, he held onto her passport longer than necessary. The line behind her grew. Passengers shifted impatiently, but he didn't seem to care. He looked at her again, his lips forming a small smirk. "Where are you going?" he asked slowly, as if the question carried weight beyond simple curiosity. She answered politely, giving him the name of her destination. Her voice was calm, her expression unshaken. She had faced situations far more difficult than this, but she didn't show it. He leaned back slightly in his chair, still holding her passport, his tone sharp. "And why exactly are you traveling there?" The woman paused for a second. She knew this was not a normal question for an officer to ask. But she answered with the same grace, providing a simple reason that any traveler might give. Still, his face showed no sign of moving things along. Instead, he began asking more questions, each one sounding less like protocol and more like an interrogation. People behind her were now looking around, some whispering, others annoyed that the line wasn't moving. The young woman stayed calm, answering each question with patience. Inside, however, she noticed his gaze. It wasn't about her answers. He had made a decision about her the moment she walked up. Finally, after a long silence, he looked down at the passport in his hand. He turned it around, tapping it against the desk, as though thinking about something. Then, with a sudden, almost careless movement, he tore the passport right down the middle. The sound of ripping paper was sharp in the air. Gasps came from people nearby. The woman stood still, her face unreadable. Her passport, the very document she needed to move forward, was now in pieces. The officer leaned back in his chair, almost satisfied, as if he had just proven something. "Well," he said slowly, "looks like you're not going anywhere today." The crowd around them grew silent. Some passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, their eyes wide at what they had just seen. Nobody spoke up. Nobody moved forward. They just watched. The young woman didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at him with calm, steady eyes. There was strength in her silence, though he couldn't see it. To him, she was just another traveler he had the power to stop. She reached down to pick up her bag, her movements smooth, controlled. She didn't want to show even a trace of frustration. The officer, mistaking her calmness for weakness, smirked again. He leaned forward and whispered loud enough for her to hear but quiet enough that others could only catch the tone, not the words. "You don't belong here," he muttered. Her expression didn't change. She gave no reaction. Instead, she let the silence stretch. Around them, the line was still frozen. A mother tried to hush her child who asked too loudly, "Why did he do that?" The sound made the officer glance around quickly, but then he shrugged it off. He waved the next traveler forward, but the young woman did not move away. She stood there, her presence calm yet unshakable. For a moment, the officer's eyes flicked back to her. There was something in her gaze he couldn't quite understand. It was not fear, not anger, but something far more unsettling: control. As she turned slightly, the light above caught the faint glint of a badge tucked deep in her bag. It was hidden from everyone else's view, but she knew it was there. For now, she kept it quiet. She let the officer believe he had all the power. She let him laugh to himself, thinking he had ended her journey. In reality, this was only the beginning. The young woman walked away slowly, her steps steady, her face still calm. She did not rush, she did not stumble. Every move was deliberate, every breath controlled. She knew exactly who she was. She knew what she carried. And little did the officer know, the story was about to take a turn he could never have imagined. At that moment, the passengers in line were left whispering to one another. Some were shocked, some angry, but most simply stayed silent, too afraid to speak against a man in uniform. The officer, still behind his desk, leaned back in his chair and adjusted his belt. He thought the matter was done. He thought he had shown his authority. But he had no idea what was waiting for him just a few steps ahead. The young woman stopped for a moment near the corner of the security area. She set her bag down gently, her eyes flicking to the cameras overhead. She took a quiet breath, her mind sharp, her plan forming. To the world, she looked like a traveler stranded without papers. But in truth, she was someone much greater, someone with skills and power that far exceeded the reach of a single airport cop. And while the officer laughed behind his desk, unaware of the storm about to come his way, she allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Not of joy, but of certainty. Certainty that his actions had just written him into a story he was not prepared for. The airport buzzed on, unaware of the quiet battle that had just begun. People carried their bags, flight announcements echoed through the speakers, and life went on as usual. Yet in one corner, a single moment of injustice was about to change everything. The officer leaned back in his chair, satisfied with himself. To him, it was just another day, another passenger he had shown his power over. He didn't care about the looks from the people behind her, or the whispers that floated through the air. He had decided she didn't deserve respect, and in his mind, that was the end of it. But for the young woman, this was far from the end. She stood a short distance away, her bag resting on the floor, her expression calm but unreadable. She watched quietly as the officer moved on to the next traveler. His tone was lighter now, even joking, as if nothing unusual had just happened. But every so often, his eyes flicked back at her, making sure she had left. When he noticed she was still nearby, he frowned slightly, then brushed it off. The crowd, however, could not forget. People in line exchanged glances. Some shook their heads, others whispered to one another. A young man with glasses whispered to his friend, "That wasn't right." A mother held her daughter's hand tighter, uncomfortable with what her child had just witnessed. But like most people, they stayed silent. No one dared challenge the man in uniform. The young woman remained steady, almost as if she had all the time in the world. Her eyes scanned the room, noting every detail. She noticed the cameras on the ceiling, the security guards stationed near the far wall, and even the way the officer shuffled papers on his desk. To anyone watching, she looked like a stranded passenger unsure of what to do next. But inside, she was calculating, observing, memorizing. The officer, mistaking her quietness for weakness, decided to taunt her further. He leaned forward in his chair, his voice carrying across the small space. "What's the matter? Don't know where to go now," he said, pretending to chuckle as if he was making a harmless joke. A few people in line shifted uncomfortably. The young woman met his gaze, her eyes steady and calm. She didn't flinch, didn't respond. That silence unsettled him more than any words could. He expected her to argue, to protest, maybe even to beg. But instead, she gave him nothing. She simply stood there with a quiet strength that he couldn't understand. Behind her, a man in a business suit cleared his throat, trying to break the tension. "Excuse me," he said softly, "maybe she needs some help." His words were cautious, but they made the officer's head snap up. "I said move along," the officer barked, dismissing the suggestion. The man quickly looked down at his shoes, not wanting to cause trouble. The young woman, still silent, shifted her weight slightly and picked up her bag. She walked slowly toward a nearby seating area, her head held high. She lowered herself into a chair, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. The officer kept glancing at her from the corner of his eye. Something about the way she carried herself didn't sit right with him. She wasn't angry, she wasn't upset, she was simply calm. Too calm. It made him uneasy. But he brushed the thought aside. In his mind, she was just another traveler without power, and he had already proven who was in charge. Around her, the atmosphere remained heavy. People whispered, but the whispers grew softer each time the officer looked their way. Nobody wanted to become the next target. Nobody wanted trouble before their flight. The young woman adjusted her bag slightly and sat back in her chair. Her gaze swept over the terminal again, taking in every detail. She knew patience was her strongest weapon here. She didn't need to rush. She didn't need to defend herself yet. She understood something the officer did not: timing was everything. As the minutes passed, she pulled a small notebook from her bag. To anyone watching, it looked like she was simply writing down her thoughts, perhaps making a travel list or jotting down reminders. But in truth, every word she wrote was an observation: the officer's badge number, the exact time of the incident, the reactions of the people in line, even the layout of the checkpoint area. She documented everything with quiet precision. The officer noticed her writing and frowned again. He didn't like that. "What are you doing?" he called out, his voice carrying through the room. She looked up slowly, her eyes calm, her tone polite. "Just taking notes," she said softly. He leaned back again, pretending not to care, but inside, the unease grew. Something about her composure felt wrong to him. He was used to people reacting with frustration, sometimes even anger. He was used to being the one in control. But here was someone who didn't seem shaken at all. A child nearby tugged on his mother's sleeve and whispered loudly, "Why is she so calm?" The mother hushed the child quickly, but the question hung in the air like smoke. The officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He told himself it was nothing. She was just a traveler stuck without a passport. She would eventually have to leave, and that would be the end of it. Yet something in his gut told him otherwise. The young woman closed her notebook, slipped it back into her bag, and folded her hands again. Her patience was endless. She had been trained to wait, to watch, to listen. And while he thought she was powerless, she was quietly preparing for the right moment. Other officers passed by the desk, nodding politely to their colleague. He nodded back, keeping his face straight, but his mind was distracted. Each time his eyes darted to the young woman, sitting calmly, he felt a strange tension he couldn't explain. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. Flights were announced, passengers hurried past, and the buzz of the airport continued. But for those who had witnessed what happened earlier, the memory was still fresh. They still remembered the tearing sound, the arrogant smirk, and the calm silence that followed. The young woman shifted slightly, glancing at her watch. Her patience was not only about waiting, it was also about timing her next step. She wasn't in a hurry because she knew something the officer did not. This was not just about a passport. This was about principle. It was about accountability. And she had every intention of seeing it through. The officer, trying to cover his growing unease, started making jokes with the next few passengers, forcing a laugh here and there. But his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Every so often, he would look toward the seating area, and there she was still calm, still waiting. The people who had witnessed the earlier scene began to sense something unusual too. A few of them stole glances at her, curious now more than ever. Who was this woman who didn't react the way everyone expected? Who sat so calmly after something so unfair had just happened? The answer to those questions was something none of them could guess. The officer thought he had closed the book on her story, but in truth, he had just turned the first page. And as the minutes ticked on, the young woman's silence became louder than any protest could have been. It was a silence that carried weight, a silence that told a story of control, confidence, and hidden strength. She knew what was coming. He did not. And that difference would make all the difference in the world. The young woman sat quietly, her bag resting by her feet. Around her, people came and went, flights were announced, and the hum of the airport never stopped. To anyone passing by, she looked like just another passenger waiting for something. But those who had seen what happened earlier knew there was more to the story. They still remembered the officer tearing her passport, his smirk, and her unusual calmness. The officer behind the counter tried to act normal. He kept stamping documents, checking boarding passes, and asking the usual questions. But every time he glanced at her, sitting in the corner, something unsettled him. She wasn't angry. She wasn't complaining to supervisors. She wasn't even raising her voice. She was just there, calm, collected, and unshaken. He didn't understand it. In his experience, people always reacted when they were pushed. They protested, they argued, they shouted. But this woman, she didn't fit the pattern. And the more he thought about it, the more uneasy he felt. Finally, after what felt like an endless hour, she stood up. Slowly, calmly, she picked up her bag and began walking back toward the counter. The officer straightened in his chair, his smirk returning. "Back again," he said, pretending to sound casual. The people in line grew silent once more. They remembered what had happened before, and they leaned in slightly, curious to see what would happen this time. The young woman stopped right in front of the counter. Her eyes were steady, her posture straight. She reached into her bag, not rushing, not fumbling, but with complete confidence. When she pulled her hand back out, she wasn't holding a ticket or a piece of paper. She was holding a badge. The officer's smirk froze. The metal glinted under the airport lights, the letters shining clearly, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Gasps echoed through the crowd. People whispered quickly to one another. "She's an agent," someone said under their breath. "An FBI agent." The officer's mouth went dry. His eyes flicked from the badge to her face, and back again. He blinked, as if trying to convince himself it wasn't real. But there it was, right in front of him, official and undeniable. The young woman spoke for the first time since the incident. Her voice was calm, steady, but it carried a weight that silenced the entire room. "You asked me why I was traveling," she said softly. "I didn't think it was necessary to explain. But now, I will." The officer swallowed hard, his earlier confidence slipping away. "I work for a federal task force," she continued. "My assignment requires cooperation from every branch of local and national law enforcement, including airport security." The crowd grew even quieter. Some passengers looked at the officer with wide eyes, others shook their heads in disbelief. The man in the business suit, who had spoken earlier, whispered to his friend, "She's been watching this whole time." The officer tried to laugh, but it came out strained. That doesn't mean anything. Anybody can flash a badge." Without a word, the young woman reached into her bag again and pulled out an official identification card that matched the badge. She placed it on the counter in front of him. There was no denying it now. Her name, photo, and FBI credentials were right there. The officer's face turned pale. His hands, which had been steady when he tore her passport, now trembled slightly. He looked around, as if searching for someone to rescue him, but no one moved. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking on his. "You destroyed federal property," she said firmly, but not loudly. "And you racially profiled a citizen in front of dozens of witnesses. Both actions are subject to investigation." The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. She straightened again, her expression calm. "You thought I was powerless," she continued. "You thought you could treat me however you wanted. But you never stopped to consider who I might be." The silence in the terminal was thick. Every passenger in line, every person nearby, held their breath. The officer finally spoke, his voice shaky. It was just a mistake. I didn't mean." But she raised her hand slightly, cutting him off without a single harsh word. "Save your excuses," she said gently. "They won't help you now." She glanced toward the security cameras overhead, then at the other officers standing nearby. They were frozen in place, unsure of what to do. She gave them a simple nod. It was a signal not of anger, but of authority. They stepped forward slowly, realizing this was bigger than they had thought. The officer shifted in his chair, his earlier arrogance now completely gone. He stammered again, "You don't have to look, we can work this out." But she didn't reply. She simply placed her badge back in her bag and picked up her notebook again. With calm precision, she opened it and wrote down the details of the moment, his reaction, his words, the time. Passengers began whispering louder now, their voices carrying through the room. "She's the real deal," one woman said. "He messed with the wrong person," another added. The young woman closed her notebook and looked at him one final time. "This isn't about me," she said softly. "It's about every person who stands here, expecting respect and fairness. And you failed them today." Her words sank deep, not just into him, but into the crowd. People nodded quietly, some even clapped softly before quickly stopping themselves. The officer leaned back in his chair, his face pale, his confidence shattered. For the first time, he realized the weight of his actions. What he thought was a simple display of power had turned into a moment that could end his career. The young woman turned slightly and began walking away. She didn't rush, she didn't look back. Every step she took was calm, controlled, and certain. She knew what would come next. He didn't. Behind her, the officer sat frozen, his hands gripping the desk. The passengers in line looked at him differently now, not with fear or respect, but with disappointment. His authority had crumbled, and he knew it. And as she disappeared into the crowd, her calm presence lingered like a shadow, a reminder that true strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it's silent. Sometimes, it waits. And when it finally speaks, it changes everything. The officer had no idea how much his life was about to change. The officer sat frozen in his chair, staring at the counter where the badge had rested just moments ago. The same badge that had turned his world upside down. His smirk was gone, his posture slumped, and his hands trembled slightly on the desk. For the first time in a long while, he was not in control. The young woman walked calmly through the security area, her bag over her shoulder, her steps steady. She didn't need to speak loudly, she didn't need to make a scene. The silence she left behind was powerful enough. Passengers whispered to one another, their eyes filled with awe. They had just witnessed something extraordinary. A traveler, dismissed as powerless, had revealed herself to be someone far greater than anyone imagined. Nearby officers exchanged uncertain glances. They had seen her badge too. They knew what it meant. And they knew what came next. With a nod from her, they moved toward the desk where the officer still sat. He looked up at them, his face pale. "Wait," he said quickly, his voice low and shaky. "You don't understand. I was just doing my job." But they didn't buy it. They had seen everything. They had heard the tearing sound, the comments, the silence that followed. And now they had seen the truth. The woman he had tried to humiliate was not only a federal agent but one of the most dangerous and respected in her field. The officers asked him to stand. He hesitated, but their firm expressions left him no choice. Slowly, he rose from his chair, his authority slipping away with every movement. The passengers in line stepped back, making room. Some shook their heads, others looked at him with quiet disapproval. The young woman didn't look back. She didn't need to. Her presence had already shifted the balance of the entire room. She made her way toward a quieter corner of the terminal, where she could watch without being watched. She settled into a chair, her eyes sharp, her mind steady. This wasn't just about one officer and one passport. It was about something bigger. She knew the system was full of cracks, moments where power was abused, where people were treated unfairly, where silence became the easiest response. But today, she wasn't silent. Today, she had chosen to reveal just enough of who she was to remind everyone that authority comes with responsibility. Back at the counter, the officer tried to explain himself. "She didn't answer my questions," he stammered. "She looked suspicious." "I was just making sure," one of the senior officers cut him off with a calm but firm voice. "Enough. We all saw what you did. This isn't how the job is done." The officer's shoulders sagged. He glanced around, searching for support, but found none. The passengers were no longer afraid of him. They looked at him like a man who had lost something far more important than a job: respect. Meanwhile, the young woman opened her notebook again. Her pen moved swiftly across the page, recording every detail: the officer's response, the crowd's reaction, the words spoken. Every note would matter later, when the report was written, when accountability was demanded. After several minutes, a higher-ranking official arrived at the scene. He had been called urgently, and his serious expression made it clear he understood the gravity of the situation. He approached the young woman with respect, addressing her by her full title. The passengers nearby caught the words, and whispers spread even faster: she wasn't just an FBI agent, she was someone senior, someone who carried real weight. The officer who had torn her passport now stood small and shaken before his superior. His excuses had dried up, and his eyes darted nervously from one face to another. The superior asked a few questions, his tone professional but firm. The answers only dug the hole deeper. The young woman stayed silent, allowing the process to unfold. She didn't need to argue. She didn't need to raise her voice. The truth was already too loud to ignore. Finally, the superior turned to her. "We'll handle this from here, Agent," he said respectfully. "Do you need anything else from us at this moment?" She shook her head softly. "No. Just make sure the record is clear. Not for me, for the people watching." Her words carried weight. Everyone around her heard them. Passengers nodded subtly, their respect for her growing with every second. She wasn't just standing up for herself, she was standing up for them too. The officer was led away, his steps heavy, his head low. The same man who had once mocked her now looked like someone who had lost his way completely. The passengers who had once feared his authority now pitied him, and some even turned away, unable to look at him. As he disappeared from sight, the atmosphere in the terminal shifted. The tension lifted, replaced with something else: hope. The idea that fairness could win, that arrogance could fall, and that silence could be broken. The young woman closed her notebook one last time. She placed it carefully back into her bag and stood up. The crowd made way for her as she walked toward the gates. No one said a word, but the looks in their eyes told her everything: gratitude, respect, admiration. A child tugged on his father's sleeve and whispered, "She's like a hero." The father smiled faintly and nodded. "Yes," he said softly, "she is." The young woman didn't react. She didn't need to. She simply walked on, her steps steady, her purpose clear. She wasn't here for applause. She wasn't here for recognition. She was here to do her job, to protect, to serve, and to remind everyone that true strength isn't about showing power, it's about using it with dignity. As she reached her gate, she took a quiet breath. The moment was behind her now, but the lesson would remain. For the officer, it was the beginning of a long process of accountability. For the passengers, it was a reminder that silence doesn't have to be the answer. And for her, it was another day of doing what she was trained to do: stand for justice, no matter how small or large the stage. The announcement for her flight came over the speakers. She picked up her bag and stepped forward, ready to continue her journey. Behind her, the whispers faded, the airport returned to its usual rhythm, but the memory of what had happened lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. And as the plane prepared to take off, carrying her to her next mission, one thought remained clear: the officer had believed he was in control. He had believed he could tear apart a passport and with it, someone's dignity. But he never realized that the person in front of him was far more powerful than he could ever imagine. The tables had turned completely. And from this day forward, the story would not be about his arrogance. It would be about her strength. The young woman walked calmly through the long airport hallway, her steps steady, her head held high. She carried no anger in her face, only a quiet confidence. The crowd she had left behind still whispered about her, their voices filled with awe. Some had pulled out their phones to share what they had seen. Others simply stood in silence, processing the moment. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something they would not forget for a long time. As she moved toward her gate, the soft hum of the airport surrounded her once more. Announcements echoed overhead, travelers hurried with their bags, and life seemed to return to normal. But for her, this was not just another travel day. It was another reminder of why she had chosen this path, why she had stepped into a life of service, discipline, and justice. She paused near a window, watching planes taxi on the runway. The sight was calming, steady. She thought back to what had just happened. The officer's smirk, the sound of tearing paper, the silence that followed, and finally, the moment the truth had been revealed. It was not about pride or proving someone wrong, it was about showing that dignity could not be destroyed by arrogance. Passengers passed by, some glancing at her, some even giving a small nod of respect. She didn't respond with words, but her gentle smile was enough. She wasn't seeking praise. She never did. What mattered to her was the bigger picture, the lesson carried forward. For the officer, the day had ended in shame. He had believed he was untouchable, that his position gave him the right to belittle others. But today, his actions had caught up with him. And perhaps, in time, he would reflect on what happened, not just as a punishment but as a chance to change. She hoped he would. Because in her line of work, she knew people were not born cruel, they learned it. And if it could be learned, perhaps it could also be unlearned. For the passengers, the story had become a moment of realization. Many of them had seen unfairness before, but they had stayed quiet, thinking they couldn't do anything about it. Today, they had watched someone stand tall without shouting, without anger, and without fear. They had seen that calm strength could be more powerful than loud protest. And that image would stay with them. As she sat down at her gate, she pulled out her notebook once again. She flipped to a fresh page and began to write. She didn't write about herself, she wrote about the lesson of the day. She wrote about the mother who had hushed her child, the businessman who had tried to speak up, the passengers who had looked away. She wrote about the silence that had filled the room, and the way that silence had finally been broken. Her handwriting was neat, steady, like her thoughts. Every word she wrote was a reminder, not just for her report, but for herself. She knew that power was never meant to be used for fear or pride. Power was meant to serve, to protect, to build trust. And when it was abused, it had to be challenged. She closed the notebook gently and leaned back in her chair. The announcement for her flight came once more, and people began lining up. She joined them, her movements unhurried, her heart calm. When it was her turn, she handed over the identification that proved who she was. This time, the officer at the gate treated her with utmost respect. He glanced at her badge, then looked at her with wide eyes. "Have a safe flight, agent," he said softly. She nodded politely, offering him a small smile, and stepped through. The plane waited, its doors open, ready to carry her to her next mission. She walked down the jet bridge slowly, her mind still reflecting on the events of the day. As she settled into her seat, she glanced around at the passengers boarding. Some recognized her from earlier, giving her respectful nods. A child whispered to his mother, "That's her, the lady from before." The mother smiled gently and said, "Yes, she's strong." The young woman didn't reply. She simply fastened her seat belt and looked out the window as the plane prepared to move. The engines roared softly, the wings stretched wide, and the ground below seemed to shift. As the plane lifted into the sky, she closed her eyes for a moment. She wasn't thinking about glory or recognition. She wasn't thinking about the man who had tried to bring her down. She was thinking about the greater mission, the work still ahead, the people who depended on agents like her to protect them quietly, without fame, without applause. She opened her eyes again and looked out at the clouds. The sunlight streamed through, painting the sky in golden light. It reminded her of why she continued, even when the days were heavy, even when the battles were unseen. It reminded her that justice wasn't always loud. Sometimes, justice was silent, steady, patient, and in the end, it always found its way. Down below, the airport continued as if nothing had happened. But for those who had been there, the memory lingered. The officer's arrogance, the tearing of the passport, the sudden reveal of truth, and the calm power of a woman who refused to be broken. They would carry that story with them, share it with others, and perhaps, live a little differently because of it. And for the young woman, it was simply another day in her life, a day that proved once more that dignity is stronger than pride, that truth is stronger than lies, and that calmness is stronger than arrogance. She leaned back in her seat as the plane soared higher. Her journey was far from over. There would be other missions, other challenges, and other moments where she would have to stand tall. But today, she had done what needed to be done. She had shown the world that strength is not always loud, and justice does not need to shout. And as the clouds surrounded the plane, she allowed herself one small thought, a reminder she carried with her always: true power is not about control. True power is about responsibility. That was the lesson she lived by. And that was the lesson she had left behind at the airport, carved into the memory of everyone who had witnessed the moment.